There's something wrong every Christmas at the house across the street. I found out the night I got a little too close to the decorations. One of the wreaths slipped loose and dropped. And when I bent down to pick it up, I realized it wasn't plastic. It wasn't fabric either. It was human hair, held together with thin wire, wrapped so carefully it couldn't possibly be a joke. For a second, nobody knew what to say. The neighbor just laughed it off and said it was old material, that he liked handmade stuff. But the moment you're holding something like that in your hands, it doesn't feel like decoration, and it doesn't feel like an ornament. It feels like leftovers. And the worst part was realizing it had been there for years, hanging right on the front of that house every Christmas, while nobody noticed. After that, I started thinking back to the other years. The noises in the middle of the night, the lights that never seemed to turn off, the weird little things that only ever happened once December rolled around. We always told ourselves it was just Christmas excess, holiday obsession, that's all. But that night it became obvious. That house wasn't being decorated, it was being prepared. Before I go back to the beginning and tell you what we discovered that night, check real quick that you're subscribed so you don't miss the next stories. I've lived in this neighborhood long enough to know how things usually work. It's a normal, quiet street, the kind where people recognize each other, wave from the driveway, but don't really go inside each other's houses. Nothing strange ever happened there, which is exactly why the house across the street stood out every single Christmas. Every year, before December had even properly started, the place would already be completely lit up. Roof, yard, windows, spots I didn't even know you could hang lights. While the rest of the street put up a modest string or two, that house looked like it was trying to compete with a mall. It wasn't pretty, but it wasn't exactly ugly either. It was just too much to ignore. The neighbor himself barely existed to us. I'd see him leave early and come back late, always alone, always dodging conversation. He never showed up to backyard cookouts, never complained about noise, never came to any neighborhood meeting. If someone said good morning, he'd give a short nod and keep walking. The only predictable thing about him was Christmas. On that, he never failed. Over time, we started noticing other things, but nothing that felt serious at first. On some December nights, you could hear noises coming from his house. Not screams, nothing dramatic, just dragging sounds and heavy thuds, like someone was assembling or taking apart something big at the worst possible hour. Then the next day, everything would look normal again. The lights were weird too. Sometimes they stayed on way too late, long after the rest of the street had gone dark. Other times they'd flicker out of rhythm, like bad wiring. There was always an easy explanation: old decorations, cheap connections, questionable taste. It was easier to believe that than to question it. And some Christmases there was a smell around his place. Nothing you could confidently name. Not trash, not sewage, just this dry, metallic scent that showed up at night and disappeared by morning. We'd joke about it, blame the wind, and move on because no one really wanted to think about it. The strangest part was how seasonal it all was. January hit and everything stopped. February, March, the rest of the year. His house went back to being just another house. No noise, no smell, no excessive lights. It was like December had its own rules on that side of the street, and because it only lasted a few weeks, everyone just accepted it and kept going. I was the first one to downplay it. I told myself weird people exist everywhere, and Christmas makes people emotional, obsessive, and over the top. I repeated that to myself for years, even when something felt off, because it was more comfortable to call it a quirk than a warning. But that year, something changed. Not in some dramatic way, just enough to get under my skin. The decorations went up earlier than ever, heavier, packed into spaces that had always been empty before. The house looked too full, like there wasn't any room left inside. And for the first time, I couldn't shake the feeling this wasn't just about taste. A few days later, the invitation showed up. A plain piece of paper left in mailboxes, inviting the neighborhood to come see the decorations from the Wata side. No party, no celebration, just a blunt invitation. It didn't fit him and it didn't fit the years before, but still nobody refused. Because up until then, everything was still just strange, nothing more. When we showed up that night, it didn't feel like a normal visit. There wasn't any party vibe, no casual chatter. All the lights were on, but the sound of the street vanished the second the door closed. I don't remember hearing traffic or neighbors after that. It felt like the house had been cut off from the rest of the neighborhood. Inside, the decorations were even worse than outside. Every wall had something hanging. Every corner was filled, like he'd tried to cover absolutely everything. From far away, it looked like excess. Up close, it felt wrong, like the house was too full for the number of people inside it. At first, nobody said much. People walked slowly, looking around, uncomfortable. The neighbor drifted through the group, pointing things out, talking about dates, explaining how he'd collected certain pieces over the years. He talked fast, like he was afraid of silence. Anytime a conversation died, he'd jump in with another detail. The closer I got to the decorations, the more I noticed things that didn't add up. Not how they looked, but how they felt. A bow that wasn't soft. A wreath that felt too heavy for its size. At one point, I brushed my hand against a ribbon and got that unmistakable feeling that it wasn't synthetic. The smell was stronger inside too, that same dry, metallic scent, heavier in certain rooms, and when someone cracked a window, it got worse. The neighbor rushed to close it and said the cold would ruin the decorations. Then one of the wreaths fell. Nobody touched it, nobody bumped it, it just came loose. I bent down to grab it before someone stepped on it, more out of reflex than politeness, and the second it hit my hand, I knew there was nothing artificial about it. It didn't feel like decoration. It was human hair, thin wire holding it together, wrapped too neatly. It wasn't dirty. It didn't look old. It didn't look fresh either. It was just wrong. I stood there for a few seconds, frozen, trying to come up with an explanation that made sense. When I stood up and showed the people near me, the mood changed instantly. Nobody screamed, nobody caused a scene, just that heavy silence of people trying to figure out whether this was some kind of joke. The neighbor rushed over laughing, saying it was old material, handmade, nothing unusual. But when you hold something like that, you know, it doesn't feel like decoration. It doesn't feel like art. It feels like leftovers. And the worst part was realizing it had been there for years. Hanging out every Christmas right on the front of the house while no one ever noticed. After that, I started paying real attention. Other decorations had the same problem. Wrong texture, strange weight. A bell that felt too heavy to be ordinary metal. A bow that didn't fold like fabric. I didn't have to touch everything to know there was more. The neighbor got visibly more agitated as people drifted away from the center of the living room. Whenever someone moved toward a hallway or a closed door, he seemed to appear out of nowhere and change the subject, saying that area wasn't ready. He'd show it later. It was better to stay where we were. That's how we found the photo room. It wasn't hidden, just off the main path. The walls were covered in framed photos. Different families, always posing in the same house, always around Christmas. Some were old, some were clearly recent, and in every single one something was wrong. Someone had been erased, scratched out, cut from the image. Sometimes just the face, sometimes the entire body. It didn't look like damage. It looked deliberate. When I started checking the dates, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every photo was taken in December, across years, and a few of the families looked vaguely familiar. People who'd lived in the neighborhood and then moved away without much explanation. That's when the house changed. Not metaphorically, physically. The front door, which had been open, was now closed. I didn't hear it shut. I only noticed when someone tried to step outside for air and found it locked. The neighbor stopped smiling and said he needed to explain a few things. He told everyone to stay calm and said there was an explanation. His tone wasn't dramatic or rushed. He sounded like someone who'd had this conversation before, or at least rehearsed it. He said trying to leave right now wouldn't help. Not because we were trapped, but because it wasn't safe yet. And no one argued because it felt like arguing would only make things worse. He explained that the house itself wasn't special, but what was underneath it was. When he moved in, he already knew about the problem. He'd inherited the house along with the responsibility. He never said exactly what it was. He used simple words: thing, problem, like he was talking about a leak that was hard to contain. As he spoke, he gestured to the decorations and started explaining the purpose of each part. None of it was random. None of it was just for show. Every piece had a place. Some were meant to contain it, some to distract it, some to keep it quiet. To him, the whole setup made sense, like a system built over many years. Someone asked where the materials came from. He didn't answer right away. After a silence that went on too long, he said some things couldn't be bought. Some pieces had to be made with whatever was available at the right moment. He didn't explain further, and nobody pushed. Then he said this Christmas had a problem. Parts of the decoration were incomplete, not finished the way they should have been, and he said it while looking straight at me. He explained that when that happens, the thing underneath starts reacting early, testing limits. He finished by saying he needed our help without actually asking. All we had to do was stay where we were, follow what he said, and not touch anything else. If everything went right, we'd all walk out without serious consequences. But the way he avoided eye contact made it clear this night wasn't following the same script as the other Christmases. Right after he finished talking, it became obvious we'd crossed the line from strange into dangerous. Not because of his tone, but because of what the house started doing. A decoration near the door fell by itself, and the floor trembled, like something had shifted beneath us. It wasn't strong enough to knock anyone down, but it was strong enough that everyone felt it. The neighbor didn't hesitate. He picked it up, put it back in the exact spot, and adjusted it carefully, like he was fixing something fragile. The tremor stopped immediately. No doubt, no coincidence, cause and effect right in front of us. Someone asked what would happen if more things fell. He answered plainly that he couldn't let that happen. The decorations worked as a whole, and pulling one piece out of place was like opening a gap. As he spoke, he moved through the house, checking corners, pressing wires, repositioning bows and ornaments like he was maintaining something alive. That's when one of the women in the group started to get sick. She went pale, then started sweating cold like she'd spiked a fever. She tried to brace herself against the wall, but her legs gave out and she slid down to the floor. It wasn't panic, it wasn't acting, it was physical, real, happening too fast to fake. When people moved to help, the neighbor told them not to touch her. His voice was firm, not loud, and he said once it starts, interference only makes it worse. He called it a clear sign that the selection had begun early. Nobody knew what he meant by selection, but nobody ignored him either. The woman started struggling to breathe, like the air had suddenly gotten heavy just for her. Her face turned red, then purple, and a thin stream of blood ran from her nose. That's when panic hit. People backed up, someone started crying, and nobody knew what to do. One of the men snapped and tried to rip another decoration off the wall, yelling that this was insane. The moment it came loose, the house reacted hard. The floor shook for real this time. Frames dropped. The Christmas tree toppled and crashed, ornaments scattering across the floor. And the sound from beneath the house became continuous and heavy, like something dragging itself along. The neighbor lunged and shoved the man away from the wall, yelling for him to stop, saying if they kept messing with it, it wouldn't choose just one. There was anger in his voice, but fear too. It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a warning he'd earned. The woman on the floor got worse. She started vomiting something dark onto the ground uncontrollably. Her hands trembled. Her fingers wouldn't close right, like she'd lost strength. That's when I realized it wasn't random. What was happening to her matched exactly what he'd just described. The neighbor took a deep breath and said there was no more time. If he didn't act, the entire house would collapse. He said he had to move before the thing underneath took initiative on its own. And the way he said it made one thing clear. When that happens, no one leaves whole. He knelt beside the woman and confirmed what was already obvious. He said it had gone too far, that it shouldn't have started like this, and he looked straight at me when he said that when the selection happens early, it's usually more violent. He didn't ask permission. He just warned us that trying to stop him would only make the outcome worse. Then he ordered everyone to step back and opened a door at the back of the house into a room we hadn't seen before. It wasn't a normal room. It was too empty. No decorations, no furniture. Just marks on the floor and walls like heavy things got dragged through there often. The contrast made it obvious. That room wasn't improvised. When he dragged her inside, nobody reacted fast enough. Some people screamed, others tried to rush forward, but the sound beneath the house surged so suddenly and so violently that everyone instinctively backed off. The door slammed shut and locked from the outside. Inside, something heavy hit the floor, and then there was silence. No long screaming, no struggle, just a dull, compressed sound, like something being pressed hard. And then nothing. The noise beneath the house faded slowly until it stopped completely. The light stopped flickering and stayed steady for the first time all night. The neighbor stood there for a few seconds, breathing like he'd just finished something exhausting. And then he started putting the fallen decorations back in place, one by one, without looking at anyone. It was like we didn't matter anymore. The house came first. A moment later, the front door opened by itself. Nobody had to say anything. People filed out in silence, one after another, not running, not looking back. Outside, the street was normal. Lights on, houses quiet, like nothing had happened. In the days that followed, nobody talked about it. The woman who'd been taken never came home. Officially, people said she'd moved suddenly for personal reasons, and the neighborhood accepted that explanation as easily as it accepted everything else on that street. The neighbor disappeared not long after, and the house sat empty. No for sale sign, no visible moving trucks, just closed up. I thought it was over. I thought the cycle had finally been broken. But when December came the next year, the lights came back on. I didn't cross the street. I didn't talk to the new resident. I just closed my curtains the moment I heard the first noise late at night, because now I knew exactly what was happening in that house. If you enjoyed the story, hit like and subscribe for more terrifying stories. And if you want to stay in that unsettling mood, the video on screen is another chilling one. Click it and keep listening.